Hello, crafty friends. This is Anya General with Ink, Paper, Scissors. Welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me today. Today I'm sharing several masculine cards with a fun mixed media look. And the star of today's projects is actually something you probably already have in your craft room: embossing folders. Most of us think of embossing folders as a way to add texture, but today I'll show you how to use them to create beautiful backgrounds with lots of depth, color, and interest. They're a great way to get that layered mixed media look without needing a lot of specialty supplies. If you enjoy card making tutorials like this one, I'd love it if you'd give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. As always, you'll find the complete supply list linked below along with my blog post if you'd like a closer look at today's projects. So let's get started. Before I begin, I wanted to show you all of the embossing folders I'll be using today. You certainly don't need these exact designs. The techniques I'm sharing work with almost any embossing folder that has a nice amount of detail and texture. The fun part is that every folder creates a completely different look, even if you're using the same colors. I'm starting with my 9x12 Altenew sticky mat and 5 or 6 panels of watercolor cardstock. I am using Strathmore 300 series Bristol paper. This cardstock is very smooth for watercolor paper, and its weight is 100 pounds. It holds up nicely for projects like this. I'm starting with the following Altenew ink colors: Misty Morning, then Mint Chalk, and then I add Frosted Sea Glass. I'm starting with light colors because I want to build up the backgrounds. You can always add ink, but you can't remove it. I'm using a Brayer. This one is old and not very smooth, but that's okay because it is still adding texture to my cardstock. I really like using a Brayer for backgrounds like this, because it creates soft, broken areas of color instead of perfectly smooth coverage. Those little variations become part of the finished design and help create that worn, artistic look we're after. Don't worry about covering the entire panel. Leaving some of the white cardstock showing gives your eye a place to rest and creates much more depth once additional colors are added. Instead of blending everything together perfectly, I'm allowing the colors to overlap naturally. That layering creates subtle variations that are difficult to achieve if you work with only one color. One of my favorite things about this technique is that there really isn't a wrong way to do it. Every background ends up looking a little different. Rather than making one background from start to finish, I like working on several panels at the same time. Not only is it more efficient, but it also lets me experiment with different color combinations while all of my supplies are already out on my desk. You'll notice that none of these backgrounds are going to look finished right away. Mixed media is all about building layers, and that's exactly what we'll be doing throughout today's project. For my third panel, I am using Cloudy Sky, Mountain Mist, and Pool. As I'm building these backgrounds, I'm varying both the direction of the brayer and the amount of pressure I'm using. Those small changes help prevent repeating patterns and keep everything looking more natural. If one area gets a little darker than another, I usually leave it alone. Those unexpected variations often become my favorite part of the finished background. I'm also spritzing a little water onto the cardstock to encourage the inks to blend naturally. This watercolor paper can easily handle the extra moisture, and it helps create those soft, organic transitions between the colors. One thing that's helpful to remember is that the backgrounds don't have to look beautiful at every stage. Mixed media is really a process of building one layer at a time until everything starts coming together. So if your panel looks a little messy at this point, you're probably right where you should be. At this point, I decided to switch techniques and add a little more interest using the ink squishing method. To do that, I pressed my Cloudy Sky ink pad directly onto my glass mat. I repeated the same with my pool ink pad. Then I spritz the ink with a little water. I then pick up the diluted ink with a piece of clear packaging. I prefer using packaging instead of pressing the cardstock directly into the ink because it gives me much more control over where the color is placed and how much I apply. The packaging also creates soft, organic patches of color that are difficult to achieve with a brayer. I can build up the background a little at a time, adding color next to the areas that already have a different shade of color. I bring in Sea Breeze and add it to my panels using the same technique. For my last panel, I switched to Coastal Haze, Misty Morning, and Tide Blue. Before moving on to the next step, I want to dry these backgrounds just a little. I'm not trying to dry them completely. In fact, I actually prefer leaving a little bit of moisture in the paper because it behaves much better inside the embossing folder. The slightly damp cardstock is less likely to crack, and it takes a deep impression much more beautifully. So I'm just removing the excess moisture while keeping the paper slightly damp. At this stage, the backgrounds already have a lot of beautiful color, but they still need a little more visual interest. One of the easiest ways to create that layered mixed media look is by adding subtle stamping. I'm using the Hero Arts Novel Prose background stamp, but any text background stamp would work just as well. I like using text because it adds another layer of detail without competing with the focal point of the finished card. Even if most of it ends up hidden behind the die cuts, those little glimpses of script help make the background feel more finished and give the eye something interesting to discover. The key here is not to stamp perfectly. In fact, I only want portions of the text to show. That broken, distressed look is much more natural and adds to the artistic feel we're creating. Once the stamping is finished, I'm adding another layer with the Lots of Circles stencil from Spellbinders. One of the things I love about stencils is that they let you introduce a repeating design without overwhelming everything you've already created. Mixed media backgrounds are all about layering different elements. You have color, texture, stamping, and now a geometric pattern. Each layer adds interest, but because they're applied lightly, they work together instead of competing with one another. You'll notice that I'm not trying to cover the entire background with the stencil. Leaving open areas is just as important as adding detail. Those quieter spaces help balance the composition and keep the background from feeling too busy. To finish this section, I'm adding one final layer with the Hero Arts script stencil. This softer script pattern complements the stamped text, but because it's applied through a stencil, it has a completely different look. Combining similar elements in different ways is a great way to build depth while keeping the overall design cohesive. One of my favorite things about mixed media is that every layer tells part of the story. On its own, each technique is fairly simple, but when you stack them together, they create a background with so much more character and depth than any single technique could achieve by itself. Now it's time for my favorite part of the process. Up until now, we've been building color and layering subtle details, but the embossing folders are what really transform these backgrounds. They take all of those soft layers we've created and add dimension that you simply can't achieve with ink alone. For my first panel, I'm using the Crackle Paint 3D embossing folder. Before embossing, I apply a little blue ink directly to the embossing folder. This is a simple way to emphasize all of that wonderful texture because the ink settles onto the raised design as the paper is embossed. It gives the background even more depth without adding another separate step. After that, I embossed the same panel again using the Lined Corners 3D embossing folder. Don't be afraid to combine embossing folders if the patterns complement each other. The second impression adds another layer of visual interest while still allowing the original texture to show through. It's a great way to create backgrounds that look rich and complex. For my second panel, I repeat the same inking technique before embossing with the Cottage Wall 3D embossing folder. Applying ink directly to the folder creates much more variation than simply embossing plain cardstock, and those little variations are what give mixed media projects so much character. I follow that with the Lined Circles 3D embossing folder. The circular pattern introduces a completely different type of movement, proving that you don't have to rely on a single texture. Mixing different patterns helps keep each background unique while adding even more dimension. For my third panel, I'm using the Leafy 3D embossing folder. Unfortunately, Spellbinders no longer makes this particular design, but I'll link a similar option because the exact folder isn't nearly as important as the idea behind it. Organic patterns like leaves work beautifully with layered ink backgrounds because they enhance the natural, artistic feel instead of overpowering it. Next is the Field Notes 3D embossing folder. This design is perfect for masculine cards because it adds plenty of detail and texture without feeling overly decorative. It's a great reminder that masculine cards don't have to be plain. They just rely on texture and subtle patterns instead of lots of embellishments. Finally, I emboss my last panel using the Tufted 3D embossing folder. I like ending with a design that's completely different from the others because it gives me a nice variety of backgrounds to choose from when I start assembling my cards. Even though every panel was created using the same basic techniques, each embossing folder gives it its own personality. One thing I encourage you to try is looking at your embossing folders in a different way. Instead of choosing one based on the image it creates, think about the type of texture it adds. Crackled, geometric, organic, or fabric-inspired patterns all create a different mood, and pairing the right texture with your background can completely change the finished look of your card. Now that all of my backgrounds are embossed, it's time to see what we've created. This is one of my favorite moments because every panel has its own personality. Even though I used many of the same techniques, each embossing folder created a completely different look. As I lay them all out, I'm looking at the amount of contrast and deciding if any of them need just a little more definition. A simple way to make all of that beautiful texture stand out is to lightly brush cloud white ink over the raised areas of the embossed design. Because the ink only catches the highest points, it instantly highlights the texture without covering all of those layers we've worked so hard to create. With the backgrounds finished, it's time to start thinking about the focal elements for the cards. For today's projects, I'm using two newly released die sets from Spellbinders, Primrose and Poetic Foliage. I love how these sets complement one another. The flowers have plenty of detail, while the foliage adds softness and movement, making them perfect for layering over all of that rich texture we've created in the backgrounds. When I'm choosing colors for my florals, I like pulling shades directly from the background panels. Repeating those colors throughout the design helps everything feel cohesive, even when the backgrounds have lots of texture and multiple layers. Rather than walking through every step of the ink blending, I'll let you enjoy the process. I'll have all of the colors and supplies linked below if you'd like to recreate these florals for yourself. At this stage, everything starts coming together. The backgrounds have plenty of texture and detail, so I like keeping the focal point fairly simple. By letting the flowers overlap just a little and tucking in a few sprigs of foliage, they become the perfect finishing touch without hiding all of that mixed media work underneath. One thing I always keep in mind is balance. Since these backgrounds already have a lot going on, I don't feel the need to add lots of extra embellishments. Sometimes a simple sentiment is all a card needs to feel complete. And that's a look at all of the finished cards. I hope this video inspires you to look at your embossing folders a little differently. They're so much more than tools for adding texture. With just a few simple techniques, they can become the foundation for beautiful mixed media backgrounds full of color, depth, and interest. Now I'd love to hear from you. Which of today's backgrounds was your favorite, and do you ever add ink directly to your embossing folders? Let me know down in the comments, because I always enjoy reading your ideas and seeing how you use these techniques in your own crafting. If you enjoyed today's tutorial, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up and subscribed if you haven't already. Don't forget to check the description below for the complete supply list, my blog post with close-up photos of each card, and any products I mentioned throughout today's video. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Until next time, happy crafting!